The game of baseball has often shown us who we are as a country. Ken Burns and his talented team of filmmakers set out to tell us why this game has earned its title as our national pastime.
It's gone! It's 7:15!
I'm Bob Costas. Please join us for an in-depth look at the newly remastered release of one of Ken Burns' most beloved films, Ken Burns' Baseball.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Not Content Podcast. My name is Jerome Cusana. I, of course, am here with my colleague, Brian, as always, here on the From the Q Podcasting Network. Please leave a 4 or 5-star review. If you are on Apple or Spotify listening to us, if you are on YouTube, like and subscribe to the channel. As always, we thank you for your continued support as we continue to produce podcasts. And Brian, we are starting out on an unfortunate note. We banked a few episodes in September, so it was only natural that something really, really important was going to happen. Unfortunately, we had the recent passing away of both James Earl Jones and John Ashton, two people that we have talked a great deal about in our time podcasting. Of course, big Star Wars fans. We talked about The Lion King. We talked about The Sandlot. We talked about Field of Dreams all this year. So unfortunately, James Earl Jones, what else can be said about one of the most iconic voices in the history of the world, I would say. What else can you say, Brian, about James Earl Jones?
Definitely an icon, because knowing some of these older celebrities nowadays, they don't really get as over with the younger audience, but the younger audience just knows James Earl Jones, man. And that's pretty cool, you know what I mean? So I'm glad that the younger fans and the older fans of his work got to appreciate it. I'm glad that he got a little bit of a cameo in Rogue One. And I'm glad that, he went out on top, I think. And he did The Lion King again in the remake, and I'm pretty sure he's going to get a shout out, obviously, in the Mufasa movie coming in December, which is going to be even more emotional now. So all these things, it's unfortunate, man. It's really unfortunate, but at least we got to review a bunch of his movies this year. I don't know how we didn't review any of his movies until this particular year, and it's kind of scary. But we also reviewed Dr. Strangelove, which is one of my all-time favorite movies and one of Jerome's all-time favorites too. So just really odd timing, but at least we got the time to appreciate his work. John Ashton, look, I'm just glad that, he got to do Beverly Hills Cop 4, and it came out this year, and it was really, well received. Probably deserved a theatrical run. That's a whole other discussion. But, I'm glad that he got to go like on a high note. It's not like not like an Oscar kind of high note, but it's like a high note well enough where like he knows that he's one of his famous roles is from Beverly Hills Cop. The fans are going to respond to that role, and he got to go out with that role, as a kind of a farewell it is at this point. So it's very sad. It's news today as we're recording, but it's quite unfortunate again. But again, like I said, at least he got to go out in that role that everyone loved from the 80s. And he got to put smiles on people's faces one more time.
Yeah, you did not mention Midnight Run, but I think that's a really important one to bring up as well, just because I think that movie is so great. And John Ashton, he's not the star level of Robert De Niro or even Charles Grodin, but he is an important reason why that movie is as good as it is. And he's just somebody that I think people are going to remember for those kind of 80s action comedies. And like you, I'm glad that he got to go out with Beverly Hills Cop 4. I believe he has one more movie in the can that will be coming out later this year. That's kind of more of an independent Oscar-y type picture. So we will, I'm sure, get some more tributes when that movie comes out. Not much else to be said about James Earl Jones. I mean, look, that this is a guy who everybody loves and who is so well revered by so many people for the best possible reasons because of his presence on screen. And there really isn't a whole lot else to be said. We are now going to move on into kind of what we were going to talk about with this episode. It is the first Tuesday in October, so we will be doing The Right Match. And this month, we are pairing baseball, Ken Burns' baseball, with a match that took place in a baseball stadium, the old Comiskey Park, Ric Flair versus Magnum T.A. We are going to get to the match in just a moment. But October is typically a spooky season month, and I know a lot of podcasts and a lot of other outlets are going to be heavily focusing on spooky season And I think in a normal year, that is what we would be doing. But October is also really big time for baseball with the postseason, the wild card, divisional, and championship rounds. It is also the 30th anniversary of the first 9 innings of Ken Burns' baseball, one of the most notable documentaries, not just about baseball, but about professional sports. So we felt like it was only fitting in the month of October to discuss this well-regarded, very important documentary. Brian has never seen it before, so I felt like this is an injustice that we simply had to get rid of. So Brian, at this point, has watched the first 4 episodes of the titular baseball. We are going to discuss the first 3. This week, we are going to discuss episodes 4, 5, and 6 next week, and then we will discuss episodes 7, 8, and 9 in 2 weeks. We will probably get another. Ben and I will be recording an episode, finishing up our Disney list very soon, and that will probably go up sometime in the month of October as well. And then we are ending our baseball movie run at the end of the month. So that is a little bit of house cleaning, but let's get to the match at hand, which is Ric Flair as a heel versus Magnum T.A. back in 1985. Brian, this is Comiskey Park is such a weird place for a wrestling match to take place, especially with the way the seating was. There are some pretty famous matches that have actually taken place in that venue if you go back to the 1960s and earlier. So this is not unusual for Comiskey Park to have it. But I hope just even in watching this match, Brian, you realize that by 1985, Comiskey Park was a dump.
Yeah, and it only had 5 years left, so that tells you everything. A little background to this event, I guess we should put. This is the first Super Clash. This is kind of like the response to WrestleMania from the AWA, and they got people from the Crockett as well to come in to kind of do a super card kind of idea. 13 matches, like names all over the card from the start. I mean, Sergeant Slaughter looks like he was in the opener, which is crazy. You had Mil Mascaras on this card. You had the Road Warriors, the Freebirds, and Kerry Von Erich, and Jimmy Garvin, and Kamala, and all these different names. Scott Hall and Kurt Hennig, Greg Gagne, Larry Zbyszko, on and on and on. And then at the doubleheader, you had the AWA World Title, Rick Martel and Stan Hansen. I forget if Stan Hansen already won the title at this point, so this might have been the rematch, but it went to a double count. That's the one thing with AWA, man. They just fuck up their finishes all the time. But
on their big shows, it is kind of legendary just how bad these finishes were.
And then the main event, Ric Flair, Magnum T.A. for the NWA World Title, which is interesting because this is actually the day before they do the Dusty breaks his leg in the cage gimmick, because that happens on September 29th. This is September 28th, and that would be the setup to Starrcade for that year. And right now, at this time, Magnum T.A. is having a feud with Tully Blanchard, and a hell of a feud. That's definitely my favorite Magnum T.A. feud for sure. I kind of wish they would have put Magnum and Tully in the spot and for the U.S. title. I know that the NWA World Title is the big draw and everything, but I just kind of wish that we had that, that match in this kind of big atmosphere out. Because, I think that had the more heat to it because, Flair and Magnum, they've been kind of on and off, right? But Magnum's primarily focusing on Tully at this point, especially since he lost the U.S. title in, July of that year, and he was about to win it back at Starrcade in the I Quit match. I kind of wanted to see that because based on the crowd reaction, it didn't seem like they were so into this match at first, but by the time Flair bled and then halfway through, it picked up a lot, I would say. It's not a 4 or 5 star classic. It's more like a 3.5, maybe 3.25. I just felt like they just didn't have the kind of heat that they needed, and that's because they weren't feuding at the time. So
Chicago is also in AWA territory. I don't know that the NWA had a presence in Chicago like they would even just a year or two later when they had the first Starrcade, not in either Greensboro or Atlanta, was in Chicago in '87, and I feel like by then the NWA had much more of a presence, so that may have played into it too. I don't know, man. I think it's also really hard with outdoor venues to get that kind of sustained heat. That's just always been my experience with those open air stadium shows, is that the heat just isn't there for a lot of the matches, especially when you're not liking the crowd correctly. So that may have played a role in it. And I mean, look, Magnum T.A. was designed to be kind of the big star of that late 80s era. I think he was designed to basically take over for Dusty Rhodes. Unfortunately, he had just a horrific car accident. And it's amazing to think that we didn't lose more wrestlers in the 80s through these car accidents. Like, it's pretty crazy to think, just with all the drugs, all the everything that's going on, and Magnum TA, who is not regarded as one of those guys, is the guy that has this horrible accident and has his career ended and basically changes not only his fortunes, but probably the fortunes of the NWA, because Magnum TA was going to be one of their big stars. And I don't know, like, I don't feel like he's the type of babyface that really would have gotten over in WWE, just because, like, he was in good shape, but he wasn't like a roided up monster. And I just don't know that the WWE was ever going to embrace him like Crockett was. And I think this match is really a hint as to what you would have seen from Magnum TA, kind of as a babyface champion. And I don't know if it would have totally worked, but I mean, who doesn't? If you don't have a good match with Ric Flair, like, what does that say about you as a performer? So I feel like the standard is, can you have just like a 3-star match with Ric Flair? And if you can't, then you probably should retire. I'm proud to say that I would regard this as like a 3.5-star match. So clearly, Magnum TA is good. But I don't know. It's hard for me to say. Like, I'm not in that mental space of seeing Magnum TA on the weekly TV as like cutting promos. Like, the match with Tully Blanchard, of course, is one of the best matches of all time. But it's really hard for me to get myself into a space where I'm like, okay, I believe that Magnum TA is the guy who's going to take over for Ric Flair in terms of the World Championship.
I mean, it's kind of a mixed thing because, the NWA champion, like I've said before on this podcast, like, you got to be a ring general. And Magnum wasn't quite that ring general, even though he probably was, the guy guiding the matches with Nikita. Maybe it was 50-50 with Nikita. But the thing with Magnum is that he's so good at brawling. I think that's his best work is like brawling with Nikita, brawling with Tully. When he won the title from Wahoo McDaniel, that was a cage match and that was a bloody brawl, and that was a good match. And I was kind of surprised because, like, Wahoo at that time was like so old and like he wasn't the Wahoo when he was like running and doing the mile runs and stuff like that. This was when Wahoo was like at like his end of his career, but that match was still good. And I credit that to Magnum's like fiery babyface kind of persona, and that's what really drew him to, like, in Mid-South crowds, NWA Crockett crowds. So I can see why, like, there might be some hesitation of him getting over in WWE because he doesn't really have a gimmick. He's just himself. So that's going to be kind of tough. They would have probably slapped him with some kind of like movie star gimmick or something crazy like that. But if he did go to WWE, but in this case, you can kind of tell, like, if he did win the world title, it was not going to be for a long time because, I mean, you can only go so far. Like, you can probably have a match or a program with Tully for the world title, and that'll carry you so far. But then after that, it's like you're just going to go back to Flair. And that was one of the issues, too, is like Crockett didn't really build up a lot of heel main eventers other than Ric Flair. So I don't know, maybe Magnum has to turn heel. I don't know, but that's another whole alternate universe thing. But in terms of this match, yeah, I don't know if it's just because it's the outdoor thing, and we've seen that before in other like WrestleManias where the outdoor crowd doesn't really capture as well the sound because it just escapes from the top of the roof. So it's interesting because I've seen some other matches in baseball stadiums before. Like the other suggestion I put was Andre and Hogan in the cage in Milwaukee. I just kind of felt like that was lit better than this, obviously because it's WWF, but somehow they just made that white ring look so good on that VHS tape. I don't know what it was, but in this case, the look still kind of looks like WWF is winning the war in terms of production, that's for sure. And even the entrances were kind of lackluster as well. So they get, you kind of have to start seeing where like WWF at this time was clearly winning the war, and AWA was probably just focusing on talent and not necessarily production. And you can kind of clearly see that too.
AWA was focused on not dying, and they were kind of failing miserably at that.
For sure, yeah, and because the intros are just like so lackluster, and it's like the same announcer.
I mean, in theory, coming out of the dugout is cool, but it's just like it looks lame. Like anytime anybody comes out of the dugout, it looks lame.
Yeah, I would say Crockett has the better presentation in terms of their entrances because I think there was that one entrance where Flair came out of the helicopter, And I think he's done that twice for outdoor shows. So, yeah, you could tell AWA was like not up to speed on some things, and they're about to lose some guys too, based on this list. Because like Scott Hall, he was gone after this. Soon after this, Kurt Hennig was going to win the title, and then bail after a year, and then Larry Zbyszko was going to end up marrying the boss's daughter. So that's kind of like the end of the AWA right there. But this is kind of like their high point. 21,000 is a lot of people for Comiskey Park on a wrestling show, I think. So all things considering, I think, this show probably did better off. I mean, the gate says here on this website $288,000. That's pretty fucking good. But considering it's the AWA.
Yeah, the problem is there was a huge money dispute,
Yeah.
and you were not going to get. I mean, Vince McMahon always said, and I mean, like whatever you think of Vince McMahon, like you think he's right. Like these guys couldn't agree to what to eat for lunch, let alone figure out like how to actually sit down and do a fair money deal. So it's not totally a surprise that this project was very short term thinking. And again, like if you're gonna do a big show, like you have to do clean finishes, and that's what the WWF always understood, and that is what the NWA and the AWA did not understand. And that is why those companies are not around, and Vince McMahon's WWF survived and thrives for better or for worse to this day.
Yeah, that's kind of like the exclamation point on this match, because it's pretty much like, the would-be Starrcade 86 main event, just toned down a little, because it just felt like Flair was kind of coasting into the first 10 minutes, but then it picked up once he started bleeding and stuff, and then he started going to old school Flair mode. But you can tell if these guys had like a no DQ match in front of a hot Crockett crowd and like a TV taping, dude, they would have done so much better. I think brawling is way better, or way more the alley of Magnum T.A. than technical wrestling, obviously, and that's where the babyface fire I think shows the most with Magnum.
Speaking of exploited labor, Brian, let's get into Ken Burns' baseball. How about that?
Oh boy, you set it up perfectly, because with the first inning when we reviewed 8 Men Out, I was just kind of like, what was the whole deal of like, why did they, what was the reasoning behind cheating, or not cheating, but like, throwing the World Series? And now this documentary just puts it even further into perspective on what the hell was going down, and coincidentally in Comiskey Park.
I mean, I think one of the things that Ken Burns really sets up, even from the first inning, is he just sets up like what's going to happen. Like he sets up the themes that they're going to be telling. And I think that there are certainly some flaws that we will get into as we go through each episode. But one of the things that I think Ken Burns and his crew does so extraordinarily well is they set up the themes right here in this episode. You have the themes of labor, which are going to come up in every episode. You have the theme of racism, which is closely related to labor. And I mean, there's a ton of stuff that's coming about the Negro Leagues. But right from this episode, you learn about the gentleman's agreement. You realize the impact that gambling had on baseball, going back to the Louisville Grays gambling scandal of 1877. And it all just continues on. And it's a consistent theme that is going to be discussed in every single episode. Labor, race. I mean, again, it's almost a cliche to say that the idea that baseball is kind of a microcosm of the world, especially a microcosm of America. I mean, but that's absolutely the case. And I think just building on those themes and really exploring them, like that's what documentaries should be doing. Like to me, one of the biggest criticisms that I have of so many documentaries that have been put out recently is there's a lot of focus on the what, but not a lot of focus on the how and why. And to me, what makes this series so great is that they're not going to cover everything. And I think to an extent, I think it certainly has its flaws, because it's very New York and Boston heavy, especially as you get into later innings. But I think what it does so well is it really, like, you understand by the time you get to the end of the third inning, you really understand just how prevalent gambling has been. You understand why the players are cheating. And I think it lends so much perspective to what happens at the end of episode 3.
Yeah, it's kind of like this, like you mentioned, the themes that come together, and all these historians come on there and go, yeah, America's game is baseball. It was like America's game, blah, blah, blah. And then you mentioned this, microcosm of this representation of America within it, and it's just like it's exactly that, because there's always going to be this struggle with race and players making money and or too much money or not enough money. In this case, for at least 100 years, they were not making enough money, and then that leads to eventually to the strike, which Ken Burns didn't even plan for. It just happened the month that this came out is when the strike hit, and I keep thinking about that and how profound that is, and how much of that message is a microcosm that leads to the very strike that happened. So it's just crazy to me when you put all the dates together about all these episodes that all came out in September, when baseball was supposed to be charging towards the playoffs, and there was no baseball. So it's just crazy to me the way that this all went down with the timing of this documentary and everything. And I had watched some of these scenes before, like the Bob Costa stuff I remember, and the Billy Crystal stuff, but I think that's because we watched some of this in filmmaking class when we were learning about how to make documentaries and certain things. The way that you're supposed to shoot a picture is very not the same way you would do it now, just upload a digital image and then do a zoom in kind of thing. Back in the day, you would literally have to take the old photo, put it down flat, put the camera above on this mechanism, and then that way you don't have any shadows creeping over the image, and then you would zoom in and take the picture, and then sometimes you would do a slow zoom in the way that Ken Burns does for his photos, and it makes it look like the photos are moving, right? So it's just these simple documentary tricks that you learn from back in the day that just makes these old footage more effective, as if you were there. So not only it's the voiceover, it's the music mixed with the pictures and mixed with the found video footage from that era. It just encapsulates the mood and the feeling of that time and era. And he does it so well that that's what he's known for. Like the Civil War, he does the same thing, and it's the same technique. And it's a simple documentary technique that documentaries have been using forever, but the way that he puts it together with the letters and the voiceover with the actors, all those different elements coming together, it just makes it feel like you're there. And I think that's what's really cool about Ken Burns' documentaries, is that he makes you feel like you're there. So right now I'm really digging it. And the version I found, because PBS is kind of wacky with their donations, quote unquote, to get their documentary on service, streaming, whatever. So I just found a old school upload. Someone uploaded the 90s recorded version they had from 1994 from Akron, Ohio. So shout out to Akron, Ohio. Yeah, the local station just aired it. So I got all 9 parts on VHS. I have it saved on the Internet Archive, ready to go, MP4 style. So I'm ready to go on part 5, because I just watched part 4, which we'll talk about next week. But yeah, I would say the first inning is basically the history of how the game was created, and then all the different themes that play into it: race and black players not being able to play. Some players have to lie and then get caught. And then, the whole gambling issue and the pay issue. I just find it fascinating that the game kind of evolved naturally in terms of the rules, which I've always found fascinating, because this idea they're even talking about, how did they figure out 90 feet was the exact time or the exact number of feet to put from home plate to first, right? It's they just figured it out naturally. Because if you make it 26 feet, you're going to have a lot less players making the first base and getting safe. You're going to have more outs than safes, right? So it's just this idea of how the game should be designed, which kind of, plays into how the game is played today. It's just phenomenal. It's just the crazy, mechanisms of the way the game was put together. And then, for the first part, I would say it starts out slow, but once, the mood kind of gets you. This feels like a late night kind of movie almost to watch. And I would say each one is a film, because it says a Ken Burns film on each one too. So I wouldn't even say these are episodes. I would say these are
it
9
really straddles the line. It really straddles the line. Yeah, this is great ASMR kind of feel going for it. It's very soothing. I would say I agree with your take that it's kind of a good late night, kind of put it on as a nightlight before you go to sleep. It's a really good. I mean, that's what MLB Network is funny, because they always air this on Christmas, so you can just imagine some people this is what they watch on Christmas, and it's probably really effective.
Yeah, I could totally see that with the mood and the warmth. It just kind of brings this warmth. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because of the picture quality has this kind of warm tone to it. I don't know, but I would definitely recommend at least getting the Blu-rays, because they're worth about $60-$70 right now. I would spend the money. It's just I was kind of being cheap about it in the moment. But the VHS quality is kind of like a throwback anyway, so I'm kind of experiencing these documentaries like in a different way. So that's kind of cool in a sense as well. So um, is that kind of covers the first inning? You want to talk about Ty Cobb and his asshole ways next in part two?
I want to get into that. I mean, I just kind of want to explain, like, kind of the first episode is basically the potential origins of the game because that is very much in dispute. Like, there were different kinds of baseball-ish games that were done in the United States, and it really took until like the 1850s and 60s for the game to kind of become more professionalized. And once you get into 1876, that really is the time when you get an official, actual baseball league that we can recognize as being Major League Baseball. And part of what I think also kind of directly connects to that is that you get this reserve clause that basically means that these guys would not be free agents for close, if not almost exactly 100 years. So I think that is very much worth pointing out because the reserve clause is very much something that is going to be pointed out. Brian, how about a beer and whiskey league? I want to bring back the beer and whiskey league to professional baseball. What do you
There's
think?
so many different leagues that they were. I was kind of like thrown back by how many leagues there were because not only that, it's each league has their own set amount of teams, right? So it's like there were like hundreds of teams, maybe I don't know, at least 100 by the by the number of like other clubs out there. It was just ridiculous. It's really interesting that like the American League was like kind of like the standout one. What at the end of the 1800s, pretty much, and then the National League followed, and then that's just kind of like it just naturally became the World Series. Like it's just kind of like a natural thing when it comes to the origins of baseball. It's like logically we have all these different leagues. We got two of the best leagues. Why don't we just put the best winners of each one in a series and call it the World Series? And it's just kind of a natural occurrence, and I just love that about the history of baseball. And then, of course, they also mentioned like a bunch of Negro leagues that were about to come about. I think that's more in part 2 or 3, but like they had to have started around this point as well. And it's so crazy to me that there's all these like stats about the history of baseball, and then the Negro leagues are just, I don't know. They started to incorporate those stats, didn't they, recently? Or am I just imagining that? Or they just kind of
They did that, and of course, all the right people got really mad about it. But yes, they are finally counting the Negro League stats, and basically, Josh Gibson is now in control a lot of numbers as he should be, and we will talk about Josh Gibson soon. But this focuses on Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was kind of the last black player to be involved with Major League Baseball. Yes, he was definitely one of those important people. And then very closely after that, you get the gentleman's agreement among owners not to hire blacks. We get the birth of Branch Rickey, who is so important to the history of baseball. Like if like the Jackie Robinson stuff alone makes him one of the most important figures in baseball, but he literally invents like 3 different core elements to what professional baseball is, and we will get to those kind of as we go along here. We're kind of introduced to John McGraw. There's a lot of waxing poetic about baseball as well, so if you're super into that, that is not something I'm as into now, but again, I think it kind of lends to this feeling. It makes baseball feel like a grand game, and I think that one of the problems that we have now is I think we kind of lost that, and I think part of it is because we have become so numbers driven and so algorithmically inclined with baseball that I think we've lost a lot of the magic. But if you want to feel the magic again, watch this documentary, and you will definitely feel it.
I'm assuming you're talking about Walt Whitman and his way with words, speaking in.
I mean, not just Walt Whitman, but like so many. I mean, Bob Costas does it. Daniel Cochran does it. Shelby Foote, who is all over the Civil War documentary, does it.
I know what you mean. It's just that Walt Whitman stuff is just so like, because if you know Walt Whitman and read his work, you should look him up because he can take like simple sentences and just extend them in terms of like pronunciation, and just make them sound poetic when it's not really poetic at all. Like he can read probably like a cookbook and make it seem like the most poetic thing because that's just the way Walt Whitman was, man. He had a way with words, and that's what he was known for. So, I was just kind of like shocked that like it went back that far. And if you kind of look back, it kind of, I think that baseball is older than Lucha Libre. And I think, from what I've heard, I think Lucha Libre, as I heard on Collision, that it started in like 1860. And I was like, I think baseball's older than that. So it's pretty cool, cultural
By
wise.
much. It's very, very close. It's very close. We're talking
So,
1860s.
yeah,
Baseball's very nascent at that point.
for sure.
So
Second
in
inning.
terms of episode 2, I really like the recaps of the early World Series. I think that's so fascinating just to think about, like these first nascent World Series where you kind of don't know what's going on necessarily. Like the World Series now is so professionalized and so organized, but I can't even imagine what that has to be like just to experience like the very first World Series or the first Subway Series, which was between the Cubs and the White Sox in 1906, kind of the first real big upsets. The invention of the poem "KC at the Bat," which is really important, and also the writing of the song "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," which is a theme that is then put throughout the documentary. I don't know. I think it's a great story. But Brian, I have to ask you, and we're going to talk about Ty Cobb, but can we just talk about Rube Waddell for a minute?
Refresh me, because this whole episode was just me like taking in all the insults for Ty Cobb. But refresh my
Rube
memory.
Waddell once led the league in strikeouts for 6 consecutive seasons, but he is the type, like he was a child. He would get distracted by fire engines literally while playing baseball. He would get distracted by puppies. He would wrestle alligators in the off season. Like this guy, I mean, this is the thing about these guys is that they were all loons, and majority of them were alcoholics, and that cannot be underestimated. I mentioned the Beer Whiskey League a few minutes ago, but that whole thing about alcohol and alcoholism, like that is a very real thing, and that's something that continues to play a role in other with Babe Ruth and with so many others. Like this is really, really important stuff, and it's important to kind of take that all in as you're thinking about these guys, because these guys, we think of baseball players as kind of being these in shape professional athletes, like they're machines now. But at the turn of the century, you're talking about working class people. I mean, you're talking about the misfits of society who literally can do nothing else except play a child's game. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes was, it was either this or the coal mine. Is that the way they put it? So that's very much this idea of like escaping the working class and trying to get a better life and that kind of thing. And it makes a lot of sense. And then the alcohol issue is like, it's kind of crazy to me that a lot of, I wouldn't say all the players, but I would say a majority of them, I don't know, maybe we're drinking before games around this time, because it's just, not a heavy drinking, just some light drinking just to like ease the nerves or something like that. Wouldn't surprise me for this era. Considering what we've heard before and like the way that some of these games have gone down, it's just like, wow, the legalities of some of these things, and like some players, shouldn't even be on the field kind of thing, and they were down the field, and it's just crazy times, man. And it's just like there's no helmets. That still boggles my mind that there's no helmets around this time. But yeah, it's just crazy.
It is pretty insane to think about. I know you wanted to talk about Ty Cobb. Now is your chance. Tell me about Ty Cobb.
No one liked him. And it seems like he was very well protected by his owners. He had an amazing career stats. Faded when he was around 42 years old, because he was, that's the natural thing with age. But he just seemed like the worst person in the world, and his teammates didn't like him. And he just seemed so unhappy and racist and violent and ill-tempered, and I don't know, man. I blown away about how much negativity came out. I thought, I heard bad things about him, but it was just worse than I was expecting. So I was kind of in shock. I don't know if I ever want to watch that Ty Cobb movie now, because I'd have no interest in watching a movie about him, other than him getting his comeuppance. But he doesn't really get his comeuppance until that last season of his. So I don't know, man. It was just so, like, the things he did, the stabbing to a black person, and the things he did to black fans and black field workers, it was just horrible. I was just in shock. So to me, like, the second inning is quote unquote fuck Ty Cobb. It's actually called something like a war, but it really feels like fuck you, Ty Cobb, for being a bastard. But then you had Honus Wagner, who was kind of like the baby face or like the yin and the yang kind of thing. And he had great stats too, and won the World Series. But it was cool, just like I guess he's like the the good guy in the situation. He was not shit on. I guess he had a good reputation about him, but it was just wow, just man, I couldn't believe it. And then I guess he holds a lot of stats for a while, and then he's still one of the top stat holders in baseball history. But man, just a guy you should not be rooting for, nor ever wear his jersey.
Absolutely not. I mean, it goes without saying, but that should never happen. It is worth pointing out that in terms of statistics, the one record that he is going to hold in perpetuity, nobody will ever break this. His lifetime batting average was 366. And I mean, he's a terrible human being, but goddamn, what a hitter, I guess, right?
I mean, if you put it that way, man, but I don't think anyone can come close because
I mean, he's a terrible human being. Like,
yeah.
I know that people want to remove him from the Hall of Fame. I just don't think I just don't think you should ever consider that, because I don't think you should make a moral argument about the Hall of Fame. To me, the Hall of Fame is a baseball museum, and if the guy is good enough to be in the Hall of Fame as a player, you put him in, and then you put all the terrible things that he did on his plaque. Like, Ty Cobb's Hall of Fame plaque should include the fact that he beat up a black person and was incredibly racist. Like, that's just what you should do, instead of trying to pretend like he didn't exist, or trying to pretend like all these guys who did steroids just don't exist.
Yeah, I feel that because it's more of a life lesson than anything, instead of trying to hide it. So, yeah, it's just really, really unfortunate, man. But no one's ever going to hit 361 lifetime because it's almost impossible at this point. You would have to start out so incredibly hot in your rookie year, like no, ridiculous.
The guy who's winning the batting title this year, I mean, he's hitting like 312, which that's the leader. Like, what does that tell you? That's 50 points below
the highest average in a year, or recently it's probably what 330, 335, and maybe like early 2000s.
I mean, guys just don't hit 300 anymore. I mean, the last guy hit 400 was Ted Williams in 1941, and I think Tony Gwynn was at like 394 in 1994 when the strike happened. So it's really messed up, man. Like, we just don't, like, back in the day, people cared about batting average, and people just do not care about batting average anymore. But I think one of the coolest things that the second episode does, as you mentioned, was, they started off talking about Honus Wagner, then they talk about Ty Cobb, and they kind of talk about their big confrontation at the 1909 World Series, which Honus Wagner won. So, again, talking about these two early baseball stars, kind of framing them as those early stars, and then just kind of letting it play out. It's really simple stuff, but I just think the storytelling is so incredibly strong, and I'm so impressed, even 30 years later, just to see how they connect everything so incredibly well, and things that are mentioned are paid off either later in the episode, or I know that they're going to pay off later on. Like, Ty Cobb definitely gets brought up in other episodes, and his passing, Brian, is going to be covered in kind of what the end of his life was like. So there's a lot more to Ty Cobb, and we're going to come back to it in later episodes.
That's for sure, and this kind of goes to 1910. So if you notice, like, each episode, starting with the second inning, it's like 1900 to 1910, and then the next episode is 1920 to 1910 to 1920. So basically, he's doing decades per episode until the last episode, which is really like a good way to like break things down in terms of like if you got 9 episodes and you want to cover the history of baseball, break it down like that and make it make sense. Even though this was still 30 years ago, like it still makes sense logically to do so. So. And that's kind of covers that kind of era, and then to the third inning, here we go. It's 8 men out all over again, but this is like the documentary format, and the more, I would say more detailed, and John Sayles was a member of this documentary as well, so he gave you more insight as to behind the movie that he made as well. So there was a lot of cool stuff about episode 3 that I really liked, and they really put into perspective of this idea that Comiskey was just not paying his players, and we mentioned the reason they were called the Black Sox in the first inning when we reviewed the movie. And they cover it in here too. And it's just like they just were getting screwed over in terms of players, and they had to pay for their own laundry. Like, how ridiculous does that even sound nowadays? That a team has to pay, or the members of the team have to pay for their own laundry when it comes to professional baseball organization. Just ridiculous. So a lot of lessons were learned from this Black Sox scandal, I would say, in terms of like the players and the owners, and it led to what, the first MLB commissioner, so to speak, right?
Yep, J. Kennesaw Mount Landis would eventually become the first commissioner, and his reputation is that in 1919 he saved baseball, and by the end of his run in the 40s, he was preventing baseball from kind of moving forward. And I mean, that's to an extent, it feels like we're kind of there all these 105 years later with what's going to happen in the game moving forward. And I mean, here it's an existential crisis because it's directly related to gambling. Brian, my God, I mean, you can literally go on your phone and bet on baseball right now. And I mean, gambling has just been a consistent theme. I mean, we were very close to seemingly having one of the best players in baseball right now, potentially not playing if things go differently. We might not have Shohei Ohtani in professional baseball. And it's pretty crazy to think about this theme of gambling just continuing with Joe Jackson and the Black Sox, Pete Rose, Shohei Ohtani. Obviously, Shohei Ohtani not guilty, but it just keeps coming up, man. Keeps coming up.
Yeah, and you mentioned the whole phone thing. It's like, I'm an old school guy, so I really don't want to do the phone app thing because I'm a kind of guy that wants my cash paid out at the end of the day. Like, I think the best I ever did in Vegas was like 450 a payout on two separate parlays in baseball, and the thrill of getting paid in cash is like the thrill for me. So I'm kind of old school in that regard, but I can see why people are just digging into these apps right now and just getting paid through PayPal or whatever, or getting checks from Canada or some shit, whatever the legalities of it all. But it's just so fascinating that gambling and baseball are just go hand in hand. But that's just sports in general. So it's just fascinating that, a lot of these scandals are, gambling related, and it sucks because now we know what happens to Shoeless Joe Jackson and his, career, and the unfortunate story with that, and how that plays out. But man, it's just crazy how this one kind of like scandal influenced like baseball for like years after, and the consequences of it all. And not only that, but like in terms of like pop culture media with like Field of Dreams and Eight Men Out, and then especially with Field of Dreams, I feel like this was just really brought into light about Shoeless Joe Jackson. So it's really an interesting kind of period in time, because like these guys were working their ass off and not getting paid for it. It just feels like they were getting used, and I know that feeling. I've been in those situations, so it's very relatable as to why they were just like, "Fuck the boss, I don't give a shit." Pay me, give me the money, and I'll fucking do a dive for you in the World Series.
Yeah, I mean, it always comes back to capitalism, especially when you're talking about an American story, and that's what gambling is. I mean, it's guys who feel like they're not getting paid what they're worth, so they're willing to kind of just throw it all away. And it's fascinating. Some other elements of the third episode I want to mention is we get the discussion of the building of Fenway Park, which incredibly is still it's still open.
And
1912,
it's
the fourth
still
season
awkward
of
looking.
Fenway Park.
And it's still awkward
Still
looking with
awkward
the way
looking.
the way they designed it on purpose like that.
It is unbelievable to me that Wrigley Field and Fenway Park, and they have certainly changed a great deal in recent years in terms of the neighborhoods, but it is remarkable to think that we still have Wrigley Field and Fenway Park even in the year 2024. We also get some background on the building of Ebbets Field. That's going to be a very consistent and important theme as we go through some of the future episodes. Some background on Grover Cleveland Alexander, who is such a fascinating individual, and I will be very much looking forward to hear your thoughts on the next episode and then get into his background even a little more. You get kind of the tragic story of Christy Mathewson, who is regarded one of the best baseball players of all time, goes to World War One, suffers terrible injuries to his lungs, and is like coughing up blood, but is like instrumental in helping to prove that the Black Sox through the World Series. So, any thoughts on Christy Mathewson?
Again, it goes back to our Wonder Woman discussion, right? Just the brutal horrors that we never really talked about, or really we knew about it. We just hardly talk about it as much compared to World War II, but just the World War One chemical warfare, man, and that's what Wonder Woman kind of showed us. And I can only imagine what that dude like inhaled to feel like to get to that point, and he died in his 50s or something like that, like ridiculous. I couldn't believe that he was able to withstand it just that many years after the incident. So, and it's one of those things where it's like the wars that come into with American wars, it's just the draft and everything, and it really affects baseball, man, and it really affects the stars, and we'll talk about that in future episodes, obviously. But yeah, it's just really tragic and unfortunate.
The end of episode 3 teases Babe Ruth, and when we pick up with episode 4 next month, we're going to talk so much about Babe Ruth. Like the next 3 episodes are basically like Babe Ruth documentary with other things being talked about as well. But there's going to be a heavy focus on Babe Ruth for these next 3 episodes, from basically his birth until his death in 1948. So be ready for that. Brian, any thoughts on Buck O'Neil so far? Because basically, he is the breakout star of this documentary.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, he's just kind of like calm and he's seen a lot, and he's an old dude that at this time old dude, but like I don't know, he's got a nice smile. I don't know if he's the breakout star, but I do like Bob Costas.
I mean, this is basically a fact. Like, in terms of people did not know who he was before this documentary, and because of this documentary, everybody knew who he was and liked him.
Wow, okay, that part I didn't know. I mean, I've known of him. I just didn't know that this documentary put him over like that. Because, like, to me, like, out of the first 3 or 4 episodes that I've seen, like, Bob Costas is the one that's kind of, like, taking me back, because he's so, like, poetic about baseball. I've never seen him like that. Usually I've just seen him, like, chew out Vince McMahon or call a football game half-assed. You know what I'm saying? So I was kind of, like, thrown aback by that. But, yeah, Buck, he's a really entertaining personality, let's just say that, and he just kind of makes the game. He makes the way he talks about baseball is kind of glowingly, and I think that's what probably makes him so, like, relatable, and people attached to him because of his love for baseball.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to have a voice of Negro League Baseball, just because it feels like it was lost history for such a long time. And this Ken Burns' baseball put a huge spotlight on the Negro Leagues, and it'll be nice to kind of have conversations about Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, and we will do that as we go into future weeks. Any other hot takes? Anything else you got to say about this?
Pay your players, man. That's kind of what it boils down to. I mean, we talked about this in the first inning, man. It's simple, but at the same time, like, if you're one of those owners that are just really frustrated that you can't relate to your players and their economic situations, it's like there's a total disconnect there, and there's probably something you should address about it. And, I'm kind of making some hints towards the Oakland A's, but, it's really unfortunate there too, because the timing of this, like the last movie we're going to review is Moneyball, and Oakland A's are no longer
it's
Oakland.
Very fitting.
It's crazy.
I mean, the thing is that what Major League Baseball has allowed to happen to the Oakland Athletics, the Chicago White Sox, the Pittsburgh Pirates, like you and other teams as well. I mean, the Florida Marlins are kind of thrown in there. Like, every single year, 1/3 of Major League Baseball is non-competitive. And the fact that Major League Baseball not only tolerates it, but seems to be very okay with it, is really disgraceful. And I think it's one of the big reasons that baseball its popularity is waning, because you have non-competitive teams. And I'm not saying, certainly the A's, the White Sox, the Pirates, these are not the most popular teams. But when your sport is struggling for attention, when you have these different cities and these long-time teams that have been around for a long time are just non-competitive and aren't even trying, then you're really setting yourself up for a lot of trouble. Because it's great if the Yankees and the Dodgers make it to the World Series, but they're not the only teams that exist. And I think that's something that baseball is not reckoning with, because the difference between baseball and basketball, football is If the Lakers and the Knicks don't make the NBA Finals, they're still going to find success. If the New York Giants and the Los Angeles Rams, if they're not in the Super Bowl or playing each other, like the NFL is going to be fine. 100 million people are going to watch the Super Bowl regardless, but it's not good. But we are going to continue talking about something that is good. That is Ken Burns' baseball next week. We will be back to talk about episodes 4, 5, and 6. Brian, any other thoughts on the first 3 episodes, which I think are really excellent, and if people have never seen it, it is well worth watching, especially if you are tired of the modern documentary style, because it is definitely not that.
I don't know what it is about this VHS rip that I'm watching, but there's something about the old school VHS hum that's also kind of like hypnotic. So I don't know if that's also enhancing my experience with this, because I know if I watch this on Blu-ray, I'll be blown away that they took old footage and made it so clear and crystal clear and all that kind of thing, what the Blu-ray is supposed to do. But this old school VHS rip is just so like, it's not even like a commercial copy of what I'm watching. I'm watching a rip from an Akron, Ohio affiliate on Channel 25 that aired this, along with like commercials and like a thing at the end, like a bumper at the end, asking to donate to PBS. So I'm just so old school into this right now, but maybe that's part of the charm as to why I'm liking this as well so much. Maybe if I watch this on Blu-ray, I'll like it less. I don't know, but I'm really digging the experience right now. And they put whoever this person is on the archive.org. Donate to them. Don't donate to PBS, because they'll try to make you donate more than you want. But I would recommend checking out the archive version, because this VHS fun. It's like a VHS old school throwback kind of fun thing I'm doing. So, and the way they end episode 3 just made me think of like the way that baseball needed to be saved after the strike in '94, and then it was home runs that brought the audience back. And what does Babe Ruth do? Brings the audience back with home runs.
Yeah, and we'll get into it all next week. So for Brian, I'm Jerome. Thank you so much for listening this week. We will talk to you again next week.